get the attention of those that we've been trying to get the attention. So the bad news is that it's been unprecedented. It's been quite difficult. And it has really shown and put it out there, these incredible level of inequalities that exist. However, the good news, I would like to say, is that it really made a lot of players that many of you, I'm sure on this call, have been trying to advocate to take action, to act swiftly. Now, they may not have always acted swiftly the way we wanted, but they did act swiftly in their own way. Governments, companies, some in partnership, civil society organizations, etc. And so the key question to me as we go through these today is why and how were they able to act so swiftly in this particular moment and take actions that were actually quite easy to take when a lot of people around the world were asking for those actions to be taken on an ongoing level for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right? So think about that as we go through this discussion, because one of the questions that is really important is about how do we maintain the level of action that was mobilized around this crisis to really address the crisis of digital inequality, the digital divide, and most importantly also from my perspective, the incredible digital gender gap that not only persists, but sadly is increasing around the world, and sadly, especially in developing countries. So can we go to the next slide, Dev, please? So when the crisis happened, one of the things that we did at A4AI and the Web Foundation, because we tried to take advantage of every moment, was we developed a very quick, what we called our COVID-19 policy brief on internet access and affordability, to highlight both the recommendations that we wanted to emphasize for all of the players to take on, but also to show that many were already taking action. So again, as I mentioned, this pandemic exposed inequalities that we already knew, but we wanted to make sure that governments took more and clearer focused actions on some of these issues. And so we put out a set of recommendations for each of the players that we work with, and we work as a coalition, as a global coalition, as some of you might know. I don't have time to tell you too much about our work, but I hope that you will be motivated to check our website and see more about how we work. But we work as a global coalition with governments, companies, public, private partnerships, and civil society organizations, research institutions, etc., to really mobilize and catalyze action that is on a collaborative basis and very well coordinated. So in our recommendations and based on what was taking place as this crisis was unfolding, we highlighted areas that we thought governments and others could immediately touch on. And I'll just mention a few examples. So some of the areas that we've worked on were, for example, removing some barriers like taxation and stopping the immense number of internet shutdowns that has been sadly a feature of governments' policies in many parts of the world. Also, of course, making sure that governments would make additional resources available to expand access, and especially to expand access in an affordable way to those populations that not only did not have any access at all, but even if they did, access was pretty unreliable. Companies also to provide more affordable connectivity, and I'll share some examples with you in the next slide, but many companies took action to change or to facilitate access to many different groups of the population. Then in some cases, some countries and governments, some governments and companies got together and developed joint projects in partnership to address some of these situations. I think a lot of governments in many companies, as you can imagine, really were put on the spot with the crisis. They were put on the spot because their failure became very clear, not just to those in the sector, the kind of bubble of the ICT policy sector that exists in every country, but it was really visible to everyone, right? As the online demands and the need for connectivity and affordable connectivity across all segments of the population became critical, their lack of action also became more visible. And so in some countries, some came together, not as far as we wish to have seen, and some things are still evolving, but it really put them on the spot, which frankly, from our perspective, has been a really good development. As I always say, I only wish we could say that digital inequality and the digital divide was a crisis as big as COVID, so that we could get as much attention. Civil society also mobilized in different ways and has done some really interesting work, and some work that has been absolutely phenomenal. And I'll share with you. Next slide, please, Dev. So let me give you a few examples, just one example of each. And we have multiple examples of these in our website, on some blogs that we've developed, but also many partners around the world have actually started curating these different kinds of sites where they're keeping track of different actions that governments, companies, civil society, researchers are doing around different parts of the world. And some are really quite fascinating. So a few that I wanted to just emphasize: the government of Ghana zero-rated all critical websites related to health, education, etc., as a way to make sure that people could have access to information more readily, and also freed up spectrum for mobile operators so that it would facilitate the ability of people to connect, but also connect more reliable. If you think about it, did we need this crisis to do this? Isn't health information and education information a public good? And shouldn't spectrum be available for the needs of the people? But it's good that they did this. It will be interesting to see how it will be followed through. Companies like, for example, KaiOS, which is a device company, well, an operating system company that has many different partnerships with different operators because of their low-cost devices, has developed an app to help keep track of different issues around health information and also provide good, reliable information from the UNICEF, the World Health Organization, etc., really trying to focus on what was reliable and avoid the kinds of misinformation or disinformation issues that a lot of the services were actually compromising. And then in terms of public-private partnerships, I wanted to highlight the work of Main one of our partners actually at A4AI, a large company in Nigeria, a Nigerian company that partnered with one of the states in Nigeria to provide high-speed connectivity to the National Centers for Disease Control in Nigeria, because they did not actually have the kind of connectivity to allow telemedicine and really quick response to different needs that were becoming, of course, urgent, as you can all imagine. And I have to also emphasize, from a civil society organization perspective, the work that the Digital Empowerment Foundation sorry for the typo there, the Digital Empowerment Foundation in India has done tremendous work, developed very quickly a program to address the needs of access and connectivity throughout rural India, and has, I mean, I hope you can follow some of the work that they've done, has been tremendous, very inspiring, and I hope that many will support them. Next slide, Dev. But so, if you think about all of these examples and these action that has taken place, one of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, is understanding who did that action actually reach. Did the action reach those that have connectivity already? The ones that didn't have it? Who is actually benefiting from all of those actions? The reality is that, and just to kind of focus on Asia, because we are with the Digital Asia Hub here, A4AI publishes an annual affordability report, and we look at progress towards policy, a kind of a good practice policy framework, across the different countries in the global South. And in Asia, which we also look at, as you can see from, and I'm sure all of you are more than familiar with these data, probably even more familiar than I, the reality is that even with a lot of action on access and connectivity, if you don't take action that will bring connectivity to the unconnected, all of those actions remain out of reach of the more than 50% of the population in Asia that does not have access, right? And when you think about women and girls, overall in the countries in Asia that we cover, the internet use gender gap is about 32% on average, but the reality is that is actually much greater in many countries. We work in Bangladesh, is one of the countries where we have a very significant project with the country, and they're very committed to change the situation. But the gender gap in Bangladesh, to give you an idea, is at about 55% right now. So if you think about who is benefiting from these actions, both at the policy level, more practical actions from companies, still remains limited, right? It's still those that can access. And I'm sure Julian and Ayesha are gonna give us more details on the numbers, so I'm gonna not cover so much on that. Dev, can you go to the next slide, please? And even the next one, I'll make the slides available so people can take a look at it. So I wanted to kind of focus on that point. If you think about some of the actions that governments have taken, in some of the countries in Asia, Bangladesh, Korea, Singapore, India, many others have taken different kinds of actions around either apps to support health services or health to link citizens to health authorities. Again, these are all services that you need to have connectivity to be able to actually use them and benefit from them. But most importantly, I'll leave it as a question for our discussion later. Look at the similarity in all of these different actions. There's something interesting about the kind of action that is being taken by governments, okay? So you see a helpline, you see an emergency service, and you see contact tracing. Those have been very common as government actions. We'll discuss those in detail in the discussion, I'm sure, but think about the similarities on that as compared to the kinds of actions that I was talking to you about earlier, meaning really bringing either Wi-Fi, connectivity, free access, etc., to the people that need, right? Next slide. Several companies across the region have also taken an interesting actions. Some of them actually a lot more proactive than I would say some of the governments for different reasons, of course, they also are able. But the question here is, some of these are actually really interesting actions. And I'm wondering to what extent some of these, especially additional data allowances, free minimum data, ability as well, or the ability of sending or making calls, sending messages or making calls. I mean, the question here is, if this is happening now, why can we not think about some of these actions on an ongoing basis? Is it very difficult? Is it that costly to provide basic allowances of, say, for the ability of sending SMS, or to have basic data, a small package of data across all of these countries? Is it really that costly? So it's good that all of these actions are taking place, but what is that really telling to us in terms of that issue? So next slide. So I guess I'll stop there. Thank you. But I hope that I've touched upon a few interesting enough points for not only Julian and Ayesha to follow up. They have a tremendous amount of data and analysis from their organizations, but hopefully also I was able to raise a couple of interesting questions for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That was great. I think it's really great that we have Ayesha lined up to speak immediately after you, because she's going to focus a little more on the demand side of the equation and the reasons why, for example, as part of their After Access project, which spans many countries in the region, as to why people may or may not use the internet in certain ways, what other barriers might exist, the absence of demand in some cases. But I think the thing that I find really compelling in their framing is when they talk about looking at users in all of their diversity, right? And I think to me, the ways in which LIRNEasia unpacks the different types of users is really instrumental in understanding this further. So Ayesha, we'd love to hear from you next. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. For those of you who don't know LIRNEasia, we are a digital policy think tank based Asian centric, based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And we do a lot of varied research in the digital space. And this is just one area, the demand side research, which I'm involved in. And we have data, so from 2017, we started some surveys in Asia along with Research ICT Africa in Africa and DIRSI in Latin America. So all in all, we covered 23 countries in the 3 regions. And from the slide, you'll see the coverage of countries. So in Asia, which is really the focus here, we covered India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So Myanmar isn't shown in all the slides because it was a slightly different time period and slightly different questions and so on. But the key thing here is that the samples are representative at the national level. So we are able to, and of course the sample sizes are such that we can do, the kinds of breakdowns that Malik spoke about in terms of looking at the diversity factors and so on. Can we go to the next set? Okay, so just very briefly, I will, because it's a huge data set, 23 countries and all of that, I'll just briefly touch on sort of the key high-level access findings, which become relevant in how we have started to think about what the implications for all of this, but the levels of access that exist, the types of barriers that exist, and so on, what the implications for that are on how we think about the responses to the pandemic and the lockdowns and everything that goes along with it. So across the countries, the 23 countries that we surveyed in the 3 regions, and we know this globally as well, mobile phones dominate, much more so than computers, and particularly in the poorer countries. So the way the graph is organized is the richer countries, highest per capita income are on the left side, and it goes in descending order down to the right. And the highest per capita income countries that we've studied are the ones in Latin America. Sri Lanka and South Africa also fall into that group. And then as you go down across towards the right, you have more of the Asian countries. So India, the big Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a few of the big African countries are in the sort of central area, and the poorest countries are on the extreme right. So that just will make it easier for you to look at the graphs as we go through this. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the same time, we also look at household ICT device ownership. And so the previous slide was on an individual level. This slide is on a household level. TV and radio are pretty much, well, across the board, TV is fairly relatively high, except for some of the poorer African nations. Radio in the richer countries, but in the poorer African countries, radio is much more prevalent in some places than TV. So that becomes important in thinking about how we get information out to people who are not on, who don't have mobiles and don't have access to the internet. Can we go to the next slide, please? And we've seen across, especially Asia and Africa, very low, relatively low smartphone ownership. So what dominates are basic phones, which for those who just, to clarify, basic phones, by basic phones we mean they have calling and some SMS, and then you go to feature phones, which have a little bit more in terms of multimedia capability, some basic internet browsing capabilities, and then of course smartphones, where you get the the richer, the fully fledged experience. So we have quite low levels of smartphone penetration in many of the countries. For instance, India, 17% of the 15 to 65 population have a smartphone. So that target, that was our survey target group, 15 to 65-year-olds. Can we go to the next slide, please? And internet use follows close behind. It follows smartphone ownership behind, because as we know, most of the internet use in the global south is from smartphones. And again, when we say internet use, we have a fairly broad definition, and the way we ask the question is it's prompted. So we ask them, have you ever used the internet? And by this we mean Gmail, Google, Facebook, email, and so on. So this is based on what people actually use, as opposed to a perception of what the internet is. Yeah. So again, Asia and Africa, very low usage, even though we have reasonably high levels of mobile ownership in some of these countries. Can we move to the next slide, please? So as I said, we thought through some of the issues kind of coming out of the current context, and the very immediate problem is, how do you reach people during lockdown situations? Can we go to the slide? Next slide, please. So we looked at first we looked at the unconnected. So people who live in households who either they don't have a phone themselves, a mobile themselves, or they live in a house which doesn't have one. So there's a fair number, millions in some countries, that actually they remain out of mobile contact during lockdown, simply because they don't have access to one. So I mean, in India, that's 50 million people, huge numbers. And the problem is, unlike regular times during a lockdown, so for instance, in Sri Lanka, where we at the initial stages, we couldn't even leave our houses. So there are, based on this, there can be places where you just can't get, you can't get information to those people. And it becomes even worse if we go to the next slide, when you take the radio and TV out of the equation as well. Sorry, it doesn't become any worse, sorry. It goes the opposite way, but there are still a fair number of, households. So again, 19 million in India who are just completely out of reach. So these are, this was one concern we had. Can we go to the next slide? And then app-based contact tracing, which Sonia also spoke about. We can move to the next slide. So, I mean, obviously it's, the level of smartphone penetration has a huge impact here on how effective those will be, those kinds of apps. And even in the case where, say for instance, Myanmar, as we know from this data, but we know in general, because they leapfrogged us, they have much higher, for their income level, they have a much higher level of smartphone ownership, right? But even still, we found from other research that they are reluctant to spend, to incur the data costs to upgrade apps that they use regularly. So Facebook, the killer app in Myanmar, the operators told us that there are lots of people who are using old and insecure versions of the app, purely because they don't want to spend that money to upgrade the app, even though the app is available. So as a result, they were looking into zero rating the upgrade and so on, which is what is kind of necessary in the cases of essential or emergency kind of services like the one in Ghana that Sonia spoke about. Next one, please. So the second issue is how do people pay for essentials and have them delivered to them? Because we know that in much of Asia, the informal economy persists, is huge, and cash is king. Credit card and debit card penetration is quite low. In this set of countries, Sri Lanka and India has a relatively higher level of card penetration, but what we saw from the after access surveys, so that between 1 and 2 years ago, at the time, the few people who are using e-commerce still chose to pay for their whatever they bought with cash. So in this kind of situation, debit cards, I mean, obviously mobile payment, and the other thing I should point out here is that mobile-based, mobile wallets, mobile money, mobile payments, the use of those were really low. So, I mean, the two, in this kind of situation, cash or card are really the main options. But the feasibility of cards, specifically debit cards, because that's, credit cards are really not that prevalent. Can we go to the next slide? And sorry, so the other issue is also with cash. I mean, so you have the two options, cash and debit card, but cash then is, you have the problem of contact. And sorry, if we just go back to the other slide, what was happening and it's still happening. I mean, the photo on the right is what I took this evening when the vegetable seller came past my house. We have, these are the kinds of ways that a lot of people are receiving their essential services. And what's happening, and then these kinds of sellers are not equipped for for card payments at all. So how do we go beyond contact payments in this context? Then we can go to the next slide. So debit cards, like I said, are not, credit cards are pretty much not prevalent among the majority, and they're not widespread. Debit cards, there are some possibilities in Sri Lanka and India, but then the issue is even the shops, the actual brick and mortar shops, the little grocery shops and so on, which are, so with, particularly in Colombo, where supermarkets are used a lot, but in this case, in this situation, a lot of people have switched to the sellers that come home, but also the small groceries, who will, you WhatsApp them your order or you call in your order, and then they'll send it across. So a lot of these sellers are not even equipped with card payment systems. So in another survey we did of SMEs in Sri Lanka, we found only 6% had that capability. Okay, we can, let's go to the next issue that we pulled out, was online learning. So I'll just show you India first, because the graphs are kind of small and, well, the graphs are quite detailed and a little illegible, but you can look at the slide set later, we'll make it available. But when we consider households, so we looked at households that have children in them. We zoomed in on those households, and what we found in all the Asian countries is that very, because they have low smartphone penetration, because they have low access to the internet, pretty much the chance of making use of any online learning opportunity that comes up for kids is very limited. So in the case of India, we have 20% of households that have children in them have an internet connection, and 27% have a smartphone or a computer. So the device and the connection, but you need both. You need both, right? So in this case, then it's just 20% of households that can make use of this opportunity. So if you go to the next slide, the regional view is here. So across the board, I mean, the best case is Nepal, which is actually the poorest of these countries. Sri Lanka is the richest, but Nepal actually has the best chance because they have almost 50% that meet both criteria: a device and an internet connection, a working internet connection. Whereas Sri Lanka has devices, we have about half the households having devices, but only 34% have a connection. So you're limited in that sense. We can go to the next slide. And then, of course, when you look, so those graphs were the overall country. When you look down across the socioeconomic groups, there are huge gaps again. I mean, India is is really bad. So the lowest socioeconomic group, socioeconomic class E, category E, has just 3% of households with kids that can make use, that can, their kids can continue learning online. And whereas even if you look at the highest socioeconomic category houses, it's just about half, just above half. And even that is quite, that's quite surprising for, these households which have more resources. And then similarly, urban, rural disparities exist. So overall, as Sonia discussed in detail, affordability is of course a big barrier. So we ask people, so in terms of device, I'll just move through these a bit swiftly. In terms of device and in terms of, next slide, in terms of the data cost. So we did this analysis for Sri Lanka using the A4AI criteria, and using that, at the time, Sri Lanka as a whole met the target of 1 gigabyte for 2% of monthly income. But when you do the decile analysis, the poorest households really don't meet that criteria. We can move on. So the last bit is really the question of skills. Are people, okay, even if people have a device and have a connection, have the resources to use it, are they equipped? Are they equipped to do so in a, not just in terms of basic uses like searching for information and so on, but more sophisticated stuff like adjusting your privacy settings and protecting yourself, and as so this is actually from adults, but in terms of kids, do they have the right skills going forward? And what we've seen in Sri Lanka, the answer is no, based on the analysis of school textbooks. So that's it from me. I think I went a bit over time, possibly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayesha. Julian, not to cut into your time, but we'd love to hear from you about the Australian Inclusion Index, but still leave a little bit of time for questions. And if people have questions on Sonia and Ayesha's presentation so far, please start typing them into chat so that Dave and I can cluster them and raise them as soon as Julian is done. So Julian wears all kinds of hats at RMIT and has just launched a new center on automated decision making and society, but you can read up more about him in the bios. So Julian, without further ado.
Thanks very much, Malavika, and thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this really timely discussion, and just great to hear about some of that extraordinarily impressive research. In Australia, I've been part of a team for a while working on developing and measuring an index of digital inclusion, and the idea there has been to provide a useful evidence base for people developing interventions or policy ideas or other kinds of research projects addressing that kind of problem. There's a fair amount of data, of course, that we've produced in the process. We've been publishing annual reports on it. And I think, Dev and Malavika, we can share the most recent one with everybody if you're interested to see it. So I'm not going to go through the data in detail now. I'll just make some quick comments. I won't use any slides. I would just say that I think the sorts of trends and dynamics that we've been hearing about are very much at work in the sorts of data, the kinds of experiences that I've been encountering, looking at the impacts of the pandemic in Australia. As Sonia said, COVID-19 has exposed very deep digital inequalities, not just in developing countries, but also in wealthy ones. So I'll say a little bit about some of the implications of some of the work we've done, and especially around affordability and what we are and might do about that. In Australia, I'm talking to you from Melbourne. The music, as Dev and Malavika would say, has not yet stopped. We're in a lockdown. We've seen very rapid collapse of a lot of service sector industry jobs. Those who can have been working from home. Schools and universities have been teaching remotely. We've seen a very rapid uptake in the uses of telehealth for all kinds of digital health and other applications, and a general very rapid move to online services in all kinds of areas of communications, shopping, entertainment, and so on. So there's a few aspects of this which I think are really notable for our discussion, and I'll just try and touch on them very quickly. Some of it involves a kind of crash merge of different infrastructures. So the household internet has become the workplace internet, the school and university internet, the healthcare internet, but it was never designed to do those things. It's being adapted very quickly and on the run to do so. But at the same time, governments are still not recognising household internet or domestic internet, personal internet connections as a basic utility. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of the problems that we've been talking about. At the same time, though, there's been a rapid expansion in governmental and other understandings of what digital citizenship involves. So it now includes all those things around online work and schooling and health and so forth. And in Australia and elsewhere, as we've been starting to talk about, there's an implicit, at this stage not mandatory, but an implicit obligation to participate in app-based contact tracing. This has opened up what I would describe as a new kind of digital divide between the political expectations and aspirations around technology solutions to problems such as COVID-19 and the reality of the continuing digital exclusion of vulnerable communities. So in Australia, we have well over 2 million people who still don't have proper access to the internet. We have low levels of digital skills and capabilities among many communities. You can see many of the details of these findings in the report. And most significantly, when I look at the data we've collected over the last 5 or 6 years, what we find is that while access has improved and while affordability has improved, and while skills have improved, affordability has been flat. The price of data in Australia and elsewhere has gone down, but because we have to use more of it as a proportion of our incomes, we're spending more on it. And that's the problem about affordability. I think Ayesha really put a finger on it when she was looking at how you break down the affordability equation across income deciles. So we see exactly the same pattern in Australia as she revealed in Asia and elsewhere. If you look at Australia as a whole, you find that Australians spend about 3.5% of their disposable income on communications, which is basically the internet. And that's not a huge problem. But when we look at the bottom 10% of the income distribution, you find that group is spending 10% of their income on that. And that produces enormous pressures on household budgets, especially in the sorts of circumstances we're in now. So the pandemic, I think, is creating a whole range of dangers and opportunities from the perspective of digital inclusion. It's animated in Australia and elsewhere the politics of affordable broadband, I think in a way that Sonia described well, a new level of coordination and activity across those different sectors that she was talking about. That's been very successful in Australia in enabling a series of positive changes where after years of advocacy and campaigning, we have seen some measures that provide genuine financial relief to low income and vulnerable communities. Some of them are driven by governments, some of them are driven by telcos and infrastructure providers, but they have been very good things. On the other hand, there are clearly a whole set of really significant dangers, given that significant numbers of communities and diverse groups, as we were saying, remain excluded. The services that have moved online so quickly are likely in large part to stay online. So the cost of digital exclusion increases, and the digital divide, while it may be narrowing in some senses, is becoming deeper. There's an added burden of digital citizenship imposed on those who are not equipped to bear it. I do think affordability is a key problem. I would say it is now the major barrier to participation in the digital economy in Australia. That's the result of a long trend. As I said, it comes out of the data that we've been collecting since 2014, but the current situation lends all of this a new urgency. So that just to finish, the danger is the acceleration and entrenchment, I suppose, of long-term trends, that deeper divide, a stratified internet, but the opportunity remains the galvanizing potential of a crisis to bring sectors and organisations together. So, Malavika, that's a very rushed account of our current thinking about affordability and where we might be left when the music stops. I hope it's helpful for the discussion.
Julian, that's really helpful. And I'm wondering, would you like to, since you had the least time, would you like to take Lorraine's question, which is in the chat window, or if Sonia has a response immediately while Julian is reading it? Because I think Lorraine's addressed it to all the participants, not anyone in particular. So whoever would like to go first would be great.
Thank you for the question, Lorraine. That's of course a really important question right now. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty behind the answer to that question, as I think most would appreciate it. What I would say is that, and think about the context of Asia, for example, as Ayesha was saying, and we've shown in our reports as well, affordability remains an issue. But in fact, in Asia, while affordability is an issue, is not as big of an issue as in other regions. So if you were to think about even the analysis across the different income quintiles, Asia is the one region that the prices of at least the 142, the 1 gigabyte as less 2% of the population as we set, is actually lower. I was actually looking, as both of you were speaking, at our lovely spreadsheet that my colleagues have prepared on that, and looking at, for example, for the 20%, the bottom 20% percentile across Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, a couple of other countries, what do they have to pay for access is between actually around 3 and 5%. So it's pretty high, but it's not as high as in other parts of the world where it's actually around 30%, 20%, 50%. So if we were to focus on Asia, what I would say is that affordability remains a major issue, but it's actually affordability beyond data. It's the affordability of devices. It's the ability to have the skills to use the right services and the right devices for the needs that the population has. So I think the equation is actually a lot more complex than pure affordability of data in this case. And I was really, fascinated by the research. We know the after access research very well that the Ayesha and team lead, and it's fantastic. But I was fascinated by looking at what you were sharing with us on devices, because I think that's exactly where some of the barriers that we are facing exist now, especially given the services that are being moved online. It's not just services that can be had with basic SMS or low-cost kinds of services where the affordability is not so much of an issue. It actually are services that require greater amounts of data, right? And I think that equation of bringing devices and the data packages together, it's really where the problem will lie, Lorraine. So I think it's beyond the question of the specific companies and their liquidity and overall recession. I think we're going to have a crisis that is going to be much more complex than we envision, to tell you the truth. And I would love to hear from others what they think about it. I can tell you that we are currently doing some research actually that will publish in a couple of months on the affordability of devices and how the affordability of devices question is going to play into this bigger picture. So I'm hoping that in a couple of months we can share a little bit more with you. But I can tell you that from preliminary results, it's actually quite worrisome. It's quite worrisome, the fact that one, the most cost-effective devices are not the devices that may have the functionality that we all expect. And when they do, then they are far off the reach of most of the unconnected or the, let's say, underconnected populations. But passing it on to you, Julian.
Thanks, and it sounds like a really interesting project around devices. That's such an important part of this whole area. I suppose another way to where I think there are opportunities actually for smaller ISPs, and where we've seen smaller ISPs really taking the lead in some areas in Australia and elsewhere is I think following in a way from Sonia's point that this is action. Although affordability is a key issue, it's not actually all about price. Sometimes it's about the design of a product or a service. And in Australia and elsewhere, we're sort of seeing some continuing innovation and evolution in the kinds of internet products, communication products, which are available. And there's no question that there are real market failures and market gaps when we look at those lower income communities. There are significant opportunities for retailers and ISPs to develop innovative products for example, remote Indigenous communities in Australia and other groups, which are structured in ways which are very different from the products that are offered by the larger players. And so I think, looking at things like the mix of prepaid and postpaid services, those kinds of things, there's scope for a great deal of innovation from the smaller players.
Thanks, Julian. We've got a couple more questions coming in. We have Natalie Pang from Singapore. Sort of speaking to your point just now, what would be some of the solutions then that we can see to mitigate this whole array of issues that all of our three speakers have mentioned? Maybe some quick hacks, or also long-term solutions. Where do you see this going? And Urs has also left a question and a comment, which is, are we running the risk to treat access and affordability or skills and empowerment in silos, given the current crisis, which seems to emphasize access issues in the traditional sense? So maybe if we have can we have a quick response? I think we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll try to squeeze in an answer there, and any more questions.
So I'm going to address Natalie's question first. Thank you, Natalie, for that. I think, and just because of lack of time, I wish we had a lot more time to tell you more about it. But one thing I can tell you is that we absolutely have some solutions that can mitigate some of those inequalities that exist. It's all about will and putting them in practice. I think the example that Julian shared about the collaboration in the Australian government is a really good example of what can happen, but other countries too. I mean, if you think about what's happening, for example, in Ghana, what's happening at some levels in South Africa and other countries, they're really good examples of how governments can be more proactive to make connectivity and access available to those who are currently unconnected or underconnected, including those that may have the very simple kind of feature phones, as Ayesha was highlighting earlier. That is the majority of the phones in most developing countries, and that's really important. So Wi-Fi solutions, a lot of policy around bringing Wi-Fi kinds of solutions with public access, etc., are absolutely critical, because that's really the only way you can bring that mass of population able to access those services. even if those services are designed to be delivered through more simple devices. I think the case of India and other countries in Asia, actually, Asia is very developed when it comes to devices. Even advanced feature phone devices in Asia have capabilities that some so-called smart devices in other parts of the world don't have. So I would say that we need to be much more creative into how governments also provide those kinds of options around free and open Wi-Fi possibilities of connectivity, with the ability of different kinds of devices to be used for those purposes, and services designed to be capable of providing the information and whatever is needed through those devices. We don't have to have beautiful graphics and beautiful videos for everything. Basic information is basic information after all. I mean, I always tell people, that's why libraries are the best thing in the world, right? Think of your phone as just a way to get to that library. And I think we can make it happen. And some countries are really showing why it's possible.
And can I just add, I know I've spoke a lot already, but just very quickly, I think it's important to think about not just the digital solutions, but the complementary analog solutions. So for instance, in terms of education, because we're greatly at risk if we continue in this way for a while, the offline children being left behind a great deal. So, but at the same time, okay, in the short and the medium term, let's figure out how to get those kids online, make the devices, data affordable, and so on and so forth, gear them up with the right skills for when they do come online. But also in the longer term, how do you, for instance, in education, how do you then you have to rethink the way that the curriculum is already taught. Right now, say in Sri Lanka, it's just hard fashion, memorize the textbook, teacher writes the same thing on, you have to figure out a lot of reworking other systems as well.
Ayesha, that's a super, super important point, given people keep talking about the real world as if it isn't a mix of these two things and as if it isn't a spectrum from the analog to the digital. So that's a really, really important point. Did someone want to quickly deal with Orz's question? And I totally understand if some people need to leave, but if a few people would like to stay on and chat a little longer, we're happy to keep this room open. So Orz's question about the silos, about treating access, affordability, and skills and empowerment in silos.
Oh no, thank you. I mean, just to say, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, there's a dynamic and an interplay and a whole set of interactions between them. I think the attention to affordability has been a positive and productive way forward to address a whole range of issues in Australia and elsewhere over recent years, partly because for many years it was not the focus. We tended to concentrate on access. We were worried about how far the infrastructure went, and governments and the private sector invested a great deal on the access side. I think it's been very important for us to turn our attention to affordability because we're particularly concerned about those lower income deciles and those kinds of more vulnerable communities. But the skills issues and of course access remain absolutely critical to understanding the actual lived experience of this for those communities.
Malavika and Dev, can I jump in just quickly?
Sure, sure.
Okay, I know that we just over time. It's so interesting to get all the questions from all of you. And oh, it looks like one of my colleagues just put in a couple of things here onto the chat as well. A lot of the projects that we're working on at A4AI actually bring in those aspects together. Urs, I think Urs was the one who was asking the question around the silos. I think we all need to be, I mean, policymakers and those working in policy, we also need to be more innovative and creative on how those aspects of collaboration that many of us were mentioning earlier actually are brought to life. And in all of the policy work that we're doing in several countries across the different regions, they actually are fully integrated. So you can't do connectivity. You can't focus on affordable access or, you know, any kind of infrastructure project without at the same time thinking about the digital skills element to it. If you do one or the other separately, there's always going to be a gap. They need to kind of go together. It's the kind of natural sequencing of policy making, right? If you do one without the other, you're really kind of messing up the whole equation, right? That whole sequencing. And we've seen that over and over again. I mean, a good example of how that has played out is, I think, in Nigeria, a country that is actually trying to adjust and correct a lot of those mistakes. But so much investment was done at the infrastructure level at some point that still now, I would say about 70% of the really fantastic infrastructure that exists in the country is underutilized. And underutilization is a reflection of lack of coordination between thinking about the skill development, the education pieces, all those other complementary areas that infrastructure is supposed to support. So they can't live in a vacuum. They have to be coordinated fully. And I think it's more complex. It makes it a lot more difficult to think about policy by integrating all of these aspects. And I think the trick here is also how do we make sure that when policymakers in the ICT sector overall are thinking about sector policy, how do they integrate the other sectors and other colleagues in that policymaking process? So unfortunately, we don't have much time to talk more about it, but I would be happy to explore further with anyone. I think my email was on the presentation, and I'm sure Malavika and Dev will share with everyone. Our team is happy to share with you any of the work that we're doing at the country level, so you can see actually how it works in practice. And thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being part of this discussion. We will share all of the resources, the slides, the reports that you've mentioned during your talks. We'll share that on the website. And just to give you a very quick heads up that next week we're going to be looking at contact tracing apps with Dr. Michael Veal from UCL, who's been very instrumental in the privacy preserving options that have now swayed what the NHS and everybody else is doing. And Sutawan from Thailand, who's done a lot of work reverse engineering Trace Together in Singapore and other apps in Asia that are being used. So we'll send out an invite to that. So thank you so much.